Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum, and welcome to another edition of Debunked here on INX Prime. My name is Sulaimaan Ravat. So it's G20 time. We've been hearing about it not even weeks or months, from last year already. There's been quite a bit of discussion about the first time Africa will be hosting the G20. 19 nations, the biggest economies in the world, together with the EU and the AU. We know Trump is not coming. No one from the US is coming. Putin can't come. The Chinese premier is not coming. However, in terms of Russia, China, Saudi, they're not really boycotting. It's that they're sending other representatives. And it's not absolutely necessary for the prime minister or the president themselves to come. If they do come, I suppose it kind of enhances the overall status of that year's summit. MBS, as we speak, is actually visiting the White House. But that's a different discussion altogether. Now, there's been a lot of hype around the G20. There's been quite a bit of debate. Many felt or feel it's a wasted exercise, won't make any difference to the lives of ordinary South Africans on the ground. Come Monday morning, I still have to struggle for rent and to pay groceries, and hundreds of millions of rands have been spent. I heard an interesting remark earlier this morning from a COSATU spokesperson when I asked him this very question on my radio program about the cost. He said, well, democracy is not cheap. Sometimes we've got to spend money to be able to secure certain, objectives. Realistically speaking, it's not like, unemployment is going to improve significantly or that there's going to be billions flowing into our coffers overnight. But there may be certain realistic targets that could be met as a result of South Africa hosting the G20. Those who are in favor of it argue, others feel it's overhyped, expectations are unrealistic, and so the debate will continue. Some of the changes we can see for ourselves in and around Johannesburg, what actually is happening behind those changes, who's getting the tenders, the corruption, where are the poor and homeless being relocated to, where's money coming from, which budgets, how it's being allocated. Those are questions, and sometimes way after the fact, the kind of dirty linen is exposed. Nonetheless, let's talk G20 with our guest, Angelo Fick from ASRI. Angelo, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the program.
Walaikum salam.
Right, so simplifying G20 up front, right? For those who don't really follow and don't understand the concept and don't understand the history, G20, who, why, what, how?
So this is supposed to be a grouping of nations, of nation states, that the organizers feel, and this is usually the powerful global north countries, are going to be important either in that moment of meeting or in the medium to long term as dynamics change in the world. And so it's the larger economies, the more powerful economies, and then at the top, the emerging economies, and also powerful regional players. So the idea was always that this is supposed to be a summit where the kinds of inequalities in power in the world get worked out between various partners and isn't just the G7 or the G8, which used to be the largest economies and the most powerful players. This is not a heads of state summit, as you pointed out. This is also not a United Nations kind of mechanism where there is going to be decision making with consequences. This is a summit to work out as one of many multilateral platforms, an emerging global order and a new way of charting ways forward into the future.
So let's look at the process, right? Because like with any event, the World Cup, people focus on the knockout stages and the finals. The qualifiers that take place months, if not longer than a year in advance, don't kind of get that much of coverage. So we're hearing terms, right? Committees, tracks, Sherpas. What's been happening in the last few months? Do we call them pre-summits, mini-summits? What topics, who, how, what's been happening, and how does all of that flow into this weekend, Saturday and Sunday, when you have the Leaders Summit? As we speak, there's a social summit underway. There's also a B20 summit underway.
So there are multiple components of governance in the world and of multilateral engagements. Some of them will have to do with economics, which is what I think many people are focusing on, some with diplomacy and military power. and that's what a lot of focus will be on. But there are also components around the climate catastrophe. There are components around inequality in politics and access, and the migration crisis. So there are going to be various tracks that will have specific topics that people have been engaging on in months past. The summit is really the culmination of a year of hosting the G20 for South Africa. Next year, the United States will go through the same process, where there's a year of a variety of meetings. So there's the youth component, the Y20, there's the T20, there are various other formats at which different components of global governance and global cooperation have to be discussed by the various partners. These are, of course, not everybody's. Unlike the United Nations and its subsidiaries, this is a smaller grouping, 20 countries, now 19, plus the one that is or isn't there, next year's hosts. So this is not the kind of space where policy is made that will then be used as international law to hold the various signatories to account. This is kind of a clearinghouse for the more powerful and emerging power states to work out their issues. And they are on a variety of tracks. Sherpas are also the people who are supposed to guide, given policy documents coming out of previous summits, to assist the new attendees on what the existing ground is and how to get ahead.
What's your assessment then, Angelo, of how those processes have unfolded thus far and the quality of the discussions and the substance of the outcomes as we know them? Because that would impact on what's going into the weekend and what's likely to come out thereafter, as much as it's not binding.
So I think one massive shift that has happened during this period was the change in American domestic politics. The second electoral victory of Donald Trump in November of 2024 meant that whatever the global phenomenon and structure was going to be before his election, that has shifted radically. We must remember this from 2016, when under Donald Trump's first presidency, the United States withdrew from all sorts of multilateral accords, including the Paris Climate Accords, among others. What we've seen in the last few months, 11 months since that January 20 inaugural of Mr. Trump, was that there is not just a withdrawal from multilateral agreements, including agreements on nuclear testing, nuclear proliferation, but also a variety of other reorganizations of his relationship with organizations that, for example, the United States is inside NATO, but his relationship with NATO partners has shifted radically, both in terms of funding and aggressive statements about the utility of NATO, threatening a NATO partner to his immediate north by suggesting they should become the 51st state, that's Canada, making designs on Greenland, which is a territory belonging to another NATO partner, Denmark. So this has been an international order in flux because of Mr. Trump's presidency in the United States. The most powerful military and economic state on the planet, the United States, is also in internal flux, so that there are internal dynamics inside the United States that has destabilized its international policy. And we've seen reversals back and forth around tariffs, around relationships with China, funding of another G20 country, Argentina, by Mr. Trump, the Nobel Peace Prize winners sort of siding up to him and suggesting that she wants an invasion of her country. No irony is intended there. So my sense is this is a global order in flux. South Africa is hosting the G20 in this particular moment, which is a tough task. And the G20 itself is also under negotiation, has been for the last 20, 30 years, those G formations, precisely because of the inequalities and inequities that poorer countries and middle-income countries have noted in these international fora. They remain dominated by the wealthier countries and by the militarily powerful countries. So going into this weekend, I think this is going to be just one more step in a changed global order and an emerging new global order that South Africa is trying to position itself in a way that it as a state and its 62 million citizens and its regional partners will benefit from.
On that note, there was a question that arose, and I would like to get your take on it, that we know how Donald Trump behaves, right? There isn't a kind of structured approach. There aren't boundaries that hold true when it comes to Donald Trump. He redefines everything on a whim, or what suits his interests, or what he feels is aligned with MAGA, or put America first, or make America great again. Is there a risk that he's boycotting, he doesn't want to avail any of his representatives for a formal kind of handover between South Africa, the current hosts, and America, the next host. Could he kind of take the G20 by the scruff of the neck and change everything now that America is at the chair? Or is it structured enough, although it's not formalized, is it structured enough to hold despite Trump at the helm?
So that's the 2026 forecast. And I think any multilateral or even host function that the United States plays for international events that role has become very tenuous, shall we say, over the last 11 months. So that we know that the United States is supposed to host the World Cup, and there are already concerns about visas for teams and which teams will be allowed in, and whether or not all teams will go, whether there will be a sort of cultural boycott that we saw last in 1984, the Los Angeles Olympic Games, where the Eastern Bloc countries boycotted it in response to the Western Bloc nations boycotting the Moscow Olympics of 1980. That remains to be seen. As for what happens when the United States becomes the head of G20, that is not something that I think is going to be easy for the United States. It has powerful other nations in that bloc, and that includes the People's Republic of China, Russia, and a variety of other countries that will not as easily be shaken. So while there may be some partners, particularly Great Britain, that the Chinese have indicated a failed empire, a collapsed empire is now just one other country. It no longer has special status. And Great Britain having exited, the EU has also lost quite a lot of diplomatic power in that relationship, so it's no longer a regional player there. My sense would be that if the G20 survives into 2026, it's going to be a test for Donald Trump's domestic politics, because he wants to do unilateral military interventions in places like Venezuela. He also wants to do those interventions in Africa. He's indicated a concern around Nigeria and its so-called Christian population. And the question will be whether or not the G20 survives the United States' presidency of the formation rather than the South African presidency of the formation.
Do you put much weight around the Chinese premier not attending, or Mohammed bin Salman not attending in person and sending other representatives? Putin, we know, is a separate matter altogether.
For the Chinese government, they've indicated that they support the South African presidency. They're sending the premier of the country, Li Xiang. Li Xiang also represented China at the G20 when it was held in Delhi, in India, 2 years ago, in 2023. So this is not a new development for them. We know that Xi Jinping has indicated a very different relationship to diplomacy since the pandemic, that he does very little travel abroad and mostly hosts foreign leaders in China. We saw this with the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II for China, where he hosted leaders in Beijing for the military parade and celebrations, and he's doing a different kind of diplomacy. As for what the Saudis are doing, that again is a very different kind of relationship, and it could be that the delegation they're sending, like the delegation from Argentina, will be senior negotiators in the foreign ministry. But again, this is not a heads of state summit, so this should not be seen as a boycott. As for the Chinese, they indicated very clearly that they support the presidency, support the multilateralism of G20, and will continue to work as they did, even though the G20 in 2023 in India was in a rival state that they border with and have had a historical conflict with that has not been fully resolved in the Himalayas.
What's in it for South Africa, right? So you hear the ordinary South African saying, a hefty bill, a couple of 100 million could end up close to $1 billion. That money could have been better spent, on core issues here in South Africa. Then you hear the likes of the COSATU spokesperson whom I interviewed earlier today on my radio program, and he said, well, democracy is not cheap. You have those who expect to see a long list of tangibles that, okay, we spend so much of time, money, and energy on hosting the G20, so we've got ABC until Z, in return. And then there are others who say, well, you may not see tangibles, but It is one of the biggest tables on which you can push an agenda, on which you can put African issues onto the table, and being a host allows you to somewhat dictate the agenda, or at least frame the agenda, frame the issues, try and push what you feel needs to come into the declaration. You are able to prioritize certain things like debt alleviation, which are of greater importance to African countries, and that there's opportunities, there's exposure to business, there's trade exposure, and you could see some benefit down the line, incrementally. Yes, unemployment is not going to be resolved, billions are not going to flow into the coffers, but incrementally there would be some benefit in the long term if we follow through and if we do certain things. What's your thoughts on that question, that realistically speaking, what can South Africa gain by being host?
So I think there are multiple timelines and they run parallel to one another, but they're not on the same time scale. So I think domestic politics works very much in terms of two time scales. Towards the next election, short-term gain, and longer-term planning for a society of the future where we are the custodians for our children's or younger people's future. And we shouldn't separate domestic and international politics as if they have no relationship with one another, but we also shouldn't conflate that they work on the same time scale. International politics, except where there is conflict, really very rarely works in the short term. International politics is always medium to long-term planning. And the G20 and its negotiations are about medium-term and longer-term solutions. When it comes to peace negotiations and the kinds of work that we saw the South African state performing in relation to the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, those are short to medium-term interventions. The G20 is to try and, one, get a new order that is not as unfair as the old order in place. And for that, the South African government may wish to have a seat at the negotiating table so that it can give input on what that new emerging order is likely to be. It is ironic that the COSATU representative is alleged to have said democracy does not come cheaply, because the G20 is certainly not about democracy, it is about power. It is about powerful nations and South Africa wanting to be one of those powerful nations or having influence over the powerful nations. Democracy in the domestic sphere is not going to gain from, in any direct way, from the G20 summit. What we have to bear in mind is that we have to have our focus on the local, but also on the regional and the global, because there is only one planet that we all have to survive on. And some of these polycrises that are coming our way will not only require local solutions. The climate crisis is global, so we'll have to intervene there and have to be at the table where that happens. The energy insecurity, water insecurity, migration crises following on from that are spaces that will require regional and global interventions and global cooperation. And so it's important for South Africa to be at that table. What we should hold our governors to account for is that when they're at that table, they're not just selling out us in order for them to benefit. So that, as the Egyptian economist Samir Amin once put it, in the global system, we don't have leaders who want to have a functional periphery in relation to the power block, but that they want a different kind of power arrangement where they protect the citizens who elect them, not just enrich themselves. So yes, if there are deals to be had, we, the citizens, should certainly benefit from them, whether it's the just energy transition, climate catastrophe, mitigation, or forms of energy securitization, or whether it is on the migration crisis, food security, water security. Separately from that, we also need to keep our eye on the shorter term, which is what are our politicians responsible for in relation to us? So if they're cutting the grass, painting the road signs, putting up new road signs for the summit, our question to them would be, there's a local government election next year. What are you doing for us when you're not having guests? We should not be those people who are sitting in the house and the people who run the household keep the nice crockery and the very good biscuits only for the visitors while we go hungry and go thirsty. There shouldn't be a cabinet where we have very smart cutlery and crockery, which is only for the visitors, and we have to make do with the broken biscuits that are kept in the back cupboard. If our governors are going to roll out the red carpet for international summits, the question is, are they rolling out the red carpet for the people who vote for them? Because if they're not rolling out the red carpet for the people who vote for them, but the people who pay and support their election campaigns or their business deals, then we have to have a very different discussion about them in the local politics, given that we are one of the functioning democracies in the G20.
The infrastructure upgrades, right? I spoke to a spokesperson for the city, and he said, no, this was always in the pipeline. We've just upped our game. It had nothing to do with G20, and that there's no specific budget for G20. That's the point he was trying to make. Now, I suppose many of us would just laugh and chuckle at that, because the obvious question is then why now? But I suppose the more important question is, how much did it cost? Where did the money come from? Was everything above board? And will it last? And if it can be done now, when we don't want to be embarrassed in front of an international audience, it does then tell us that it can be done at other times, and then begs the question why it isn't.
Yes, the question is precisely, why is this not being done as a rule? Why did the president have to intervene in the governance of the city of Johannesburg, as he did earlier in 2025, when things looked like they were really going awry ahead of this? Why was the provincial government so keen to intervene in 2025, but not earlier, when issues were happening, the same issues that were plaguing us in 2025 had plagued us in 24, 23, 22, 21, 20. So again, the question of our governors should be, it's nice for politicians and elected officials and appointed city governors to say, oh no, this was always in the pipeline. But we have the track record. If it was in the pipeline, one, think of that Bart building in which several people died, which has still not been fixed. Think of the explosion in Lillian Ngoyi Street in downtown Johannesburg, and whether that has not been fixed. Think of how long it's taken for the city library, the City of Johannesburg library, to be fixed. Think of the multiple thousands, if not tens of thousands of potholes that have not been fixed. And then look at where the potholes are being fixed, where the lines are being drawn. They're only on the main roads, only on the arterial roads. For the people who live off of those roads, very little has changed. The inner city has been cleaned up temporarily, but we have had this before. In 2010, ahead of the World Cup, all sorts of measures were put in place. And the moment the World Cup was done, we scaled back into the, sort of stop-start chaotic business of managing those cities that had hosted World Cup events for that period. We also have to be very careful with the lessons learned on 2010, where we had instant FIFA courts where people could be arrested, tried, and sentenced within 45 minutes. Don't repeat themselves. But we still live in a constitutional republic, and that in order to ensure security, the threat by the Gauteng Premier that the criminals should beware should not become about ordinary, very poor people suddenly paying the price and ending up in prison in a 45-minute process, when other people having far more, sort of just causes are waiting years and years for the justice to be served.
Yeah, I suppose that is spot on, Angelo. So G20 is here, it's happening. By Sunday evening, it'll be done and dusted. And I suppose for some time after that, the debate will continue around some issues, and then we move on, and it's back to the same old issues that we discuss and debate and argue over on a daily basis. We then go into a kind of end of year mood, and then we move into the new year, 2026, which is an election year, because it's towards the end of that year that the local government election will be due.